everyone. I'm really glad to be here today with Laurie Dennett, who is a Canadian and the past chair of the Confraternity of St. James, and Lea Pennock, who is a past president of the Canadian Company of Pilgrims. Lea is going to give Laurie a few questions to answer that are based on her most recent book, Waybread. And we may be even straying into A Hug for the Apostle. I don't know that was recently reissued. So we've had two glorious opportunities to have conversations with Laurie coming out of the publication of these books. So thank you both for being here today, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers. And I'm just going to step right out of the way. Go ahead.
Well, hello, Laurie, and it feels appropriate to greet you on this Canada Day long weekend, and thank you for making time to be with us.
Well, that's so nice to be able to do that. And here I am in my kitchen in Spain, and you're in Saskatchewan. It's so amazing. Technology is sometimes wonderful.
That's right, yes. And let's hope it continues to be so today.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, thank you for the invitation. Just grand.
Our pleasure. As Tom mentioned, we're here to talk about your book, Waybread, and also, or specifically, the fifth chapter of that. But I just want to ask you more generally about the book. You've described it as a book about the heritage of the Camino, and it really is a series or a collection of a series of essays and presentations that you've made, and you've subtitled it "Memories of the Camino for the Onward Journey." And I just want to ask you what your concept was for the book, what your hopes were for it, and also more specifically, what you meant by the onward journey.
Well, I tried to be fairly clear about this in the introduction to the book, because it grew out of my experience of the pandemic. A lot of the time I was, as we all were, wherever we were, locked up on our own for the most part. And I was here, and I had to deal with a rather large garden all on my own, because the chap who comes up here to trim the labyrinth, and do the really heavy stuff lives on the other side of the provincial border and was forbidden to cross the provincial border. So there was no help for it. I just had to buckle down and do everything. And I had been stuck in Toronto for 17 weeks. When I got back, the garden was in the most unbelievable state. All the grass was up to my waist and the weeds were higher than the hydrangeas. It was just amazing. So I just got down to work and started that. So I had a lot of time to think while I was doing that. And I've been thinking about the effects of the pandemic on the Camino, and a lot of things that I had been seeing happening on the Camino in the previous years, and just wondering how things were going to be afterwards. And these thoughts were really going on in the back of my mind day after day, week after week, and then, as it turned out, month after month while doing this. And when I wasn't pulling weeds, I was reading, and I was reading a lot of stuff about the early period of when the Camino was just getting going. Don Elias Valina's little bulletin, a tiny little mimeographed thing that began with 50 people and really built up the readership for Peregrino magazine, which took over from it. And I went back and reread Peregrino. I went back and looked at the Confraternity Bulletin and all that kind of thing. For once, we all had time to be able to do that. And so all of that was kind of milling around at the same time. The garden as the field of physical activity, and my mind full of Camino related things. And there had been a lot of things on my mind about the Camino for quite a time before the pandemic. And one of them is simply the incontrovertible fact that the pioneers who put it all together and got it going back in the late 80s, 90s are disappearing. They're dying off. And all that memory and experience is going with them, or a lot of it is, or I felt a lot of it was. And I kept on thinking, so many pilgrims now in these huge groups that we have who arrive in O Cebreiro and they don't know who Dona Lea Svalinia is. And they don't know who somebody like San Juan de Ortega or Santo Domingo de la Calzada was, or they don't know the story of the miracle that happened in O Cebreiro. And I thought, who's going to tell them all that? And and a lot of other things that really were making me wonder what the pilgrim experience was going to be like when things opened up again. And one thing that really weighed on my mind, the more I saw in 2019-20 and coming up to the double holy year, was just how very commodified and commercialized some aspects of the Camino had become. And I could see by the looks on faces of people who come into the bar in O Cebreiro and they ask if there are any rooms left, or they ask what the price is, and somebody says what price is, and their faces fall, because not everybody can pay for a room every night. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times the albergues would be full. And I thought, this is really a tricky one, because what happens if somebody's walked all the way from Germany and they simply can't afford to fund themselves right the way across Spain, staying in private facilities because the municipal ones are full, or because the donativo-based ones are full? And so all of this was milling around in my mind, all these ideas, some of them very close together and others miles apart. And what I came up with was the need really to pass on a lot of the knowledge that I feel is kind of getting left behind, and also ensuring that there is still a place for everybody on the Camino, whether they've got very much economic wherewithal or not. And the kinds of pressures that the donativo-based albergues have come under the last few years. So all of that had me scratching my head and wondering what I could do. And it was during the pandemic and yanking all those weeds and things that I kept on coming across this little plant that just refused to be banished, as I put it in the book. I would tear it out, and the next week there it would be in the same place again. And I didn't seem to be able to get rid of it. And it exasperated me thoroughly until I looked it up and found out what it was called, and that it had a very long history, and that it's actually a very beneficial little plant. And in Anglo-Saxon, its name was Waybread. And it's edible, it's medicinal, it grows everywhere, all the way from Finland to the Mediterranean. And people on the move used to make tremendous use of it wherever they were coming from and going to. It was a mainstay of the diet of people on the move in the Middle Ages. And so, all of that, I thought maybe I can make something out of this with essays that I have to hand that pull together a lot of the information that I'd produced for conference papers and articles and things like that. And maybe the approach to putting this material in front of modern pilgrims is, you can't expect people to make reasonable decisions if they haven't got the information. So you give them the information and say, well, look, your task is, don't forget about this. When the politicians tell you that they've done it all, you know better, because you've read about it and you know that history, and you've heard about the people that actually did lay the groundwork. And so don't be told in the Museum of the Pilgrimage, as in the video, that politicians did it all. They'd love you to think that, but that is not true. So So that's how it all kind of came together. So, memories of the Camino, that's obvious from what I've just said. But for the onward journey is what we do with that. It's where we go from here, and whether we allow that history to be, in a sense, airbrushed out of existence because it suits certain groups of people for that to happen, or whether we kind of say, well, hold on a minute, what about Pablo Payo, who was feeding pilgrims in the 1950s and 60s? What about Chonina, whose grandparents were looking after pilgrims, always laid an extra place at the table back in the 30s and 40s? Jesus Hato's grandmother did the same. And people like that kept the Camino alive through the centuries. We must not forget them or allow anybody else to just step over them and sideline them. So that's what the onward journey is about. Hang in there with what you know and keep saying it. Just be like the little plant and refuse to be banished, I guess, is the long answer to a short question.
Well, and what a wonderful gift and legacy of the pandemic, which wasn't always a good thing for everybody, but there are some great things that came out of it, and I would say one of them is your book. So thank you for that, and for the time that that the pandemic gave us to reflect on what really matters, because that's
very true.
Yeah.
Yes.
As I said earlier, we're focusing today on one chapter of your book, and the chapter has a lovely title, which is To Be a Pilgrim, from the old hymn. And
Yes.
It is based on your notes from a 1996 meeting of the Confraternity of St. James, the UK-based Camino organization. And in the book, we learned that the reason for this special meeting was to talk about what some were seeing as the over-promotion, even then, 25 years ago, more than 25 years ago, of the Camino de Santiago. And there was apparently concern that the recent Holy Year was turning the Camino into a venue for mass tourism. And of course, we've just ended 2 consecutive Holy Years, and it would probably be fair to say that those same concerns are even more pressing now. And so I wonder what we can learn from the discussions and realizations that you had in 1996. Is that conversation and its conclusions still relevant to some of the problems we're facing today concerning massification of the Camino?
Yeah, I mean, back then, in 1995, that meeting was called to consider the effects of a Holy Year that had sent 100,000 pilgrims down the Camino, and none of us could even imagine numbers like that. Nobody had seen anything like that. I think nobody was prepared for that. So there were a lot of questions that arose out of it, and the facilities to deal with numbers like that didn't really exist then. I think that was the real consternation. And of course now they haven't quite kept up with it, but there are so many more facilities now. And I don't want to sound as though I am against tourism as such. I'm not at all. And I do recognize the amazing role that the Camino and the development of the Camino has played in the economy of Galicia and the economy of northern Spain as a whole. It has lifted whole areas out of really dismal rural poverty of the kind that I described in A Hug for the Apostle, depopulated villages where you'd have 1 or 2 old people living in places where the roof had fallen in, and the road was dreadful and they had nowhere to go, so they had to stay there. And it was, and we've got villages like that around where I live here, where a very, very few elderly folk kept going by the mobile supermarket. But back then, the infrastructure that can entertain the thought of 3 times that number of pilgrims and rising just didn't exist. And the kinds of distances people had to cover were immense. because there was nowhere to stay in between. You can't say that nowadays. Pretty well anybody, from a family with small children to a retired person with a dicky knee, or even somebody with a disability, a moderate disability anyway. I've known people to do the Camino in wheelchairs, but they can all do this, what has become a very inclusive experience. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. And in which we can all be very proud and really rejoice in that. But back then, things did look very different. And I think my concerns now would be purely, they would be two things. One, the quality of the experience that pilgrims have when there are simply so many huge groups of people moving through, people who are seeking silence and possibly solitude, are really driven onto a different Camino than the Camino Frances, because it just has become quite different, unless they want to do it out of season and come when the weather may not be so good, and they find their solitude and silence then. But also the economic factor that it can become, certainly at the height of the summer, day after day after day, when places are crowded and there's may not be anywhere to stay, of people finding it impossible to carry on economically, because everywhere is simply something you have to pay for, and not something that you can make a donation to, either in kind or out of your own pocket, but something more reasonable that you can afford, and then pick up the broom and do something else, or go and dig the vegetable plot. In Rabanal we have the herb garden, and people are always helping out with that, or doing something in the huerta. There's scope for that, whereas in 25 years ago there really wasn't, because those things were barely off the ground. So and also I think attitudes have changed. I mean, back in 1995, the inroads of technology were not what they are today. And people would think of phoning home, going out to the phone box, or even a very early, rather clunky mobile to ring home. But they wouldn't be on a mobile phone all the time, as I do observe a lot of pilgrims to be. When I see them, and you see a whole group of pilgrims walking along, each and every one of them, looking at a mobile phone instead of enjoying the nature that they're walking through. I'm not sure that's an advance of any kind, really. I think it's such a special time out of time to be able to revel in the natural world. It's as though the sense of proportion and priority is taking a back seat sometimes. But anyway, not everyone is like that. And of course, it's a matter of personal choice what people want to do. But I do hope that they leave some space for enjoying the natural world around, because it is so glorious on the Camino. It's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned a couple of potential threats to the pilgrim experience, one being just simply the number of people competing for space on the Camino, and the other being technology. Do you see any other threats to the pilgrim experience, or would those be the main ones? Or?
Well, no, I think the main one I would see, especially for people traveling in groups have their own social dynamic. And people walk along and they get to know other pilgrims, which is wonderful. But if you get a parish group or a school party or a group of people from an organization, even the army on horseback, they don't really interact with local people. And that one of the great joys of the Camino is meeting the local people, even if you haven't a word of Spanish. Some of those exchanges that you may have with somebody just working who stands up and comes over into the hedge or the wall to ask where you're from, or ask if you need anything, a drink or something. Those exchanges are so precious. And I had a lot of that in 1986, and I know right into the 90s, people did have that. But I began to worry about that in the early 2000s, whether the whole thing was becoming so organized in the sense of nothing left to happenstance, nothing left to possibility or chance, really, and very, very little opportunity to really connect with anybody along the route, as opposed to other pilgrims. I see that the pilgrim experience is very much involves the people that live along the Camino, who are the ones who have sustained it for such a long time.
Mhm.
They're very interested in pilgrims and the experience that they have. And I think that would be disheartening for them to feel that pilgrims were so self-contained and so self-sufficient that there were no longer people to connect with.
In that sense, I wonder if some of we think of the Camino Frances as the kind of authentic pilgrimage route, or at least the quintessential Camino de Santiago, but there are alternative routes, and some of which are not very well known, and where you do encounter more of the local people along the way. I wonder if you can have as authentic a pilgrim experience on some of those alternative or lesser known routes.
Oh, I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. I always, maybe we all feel that because for most of us, the Camino Frances was the first one we did. It was the one that just knocked us sideways, and you never really forget that. But I had the son of a friend come and stay after his Camino from Bilbao to Santiago on the Camino del Norte. And this was a young, well, he's not that young, he's 51. He started off rather unfit and not at all knowing whether he would make it, and just determined that he would. And when he got here, and he just could not stop talking about what a wonderful, wonderful experience he'd had. And the people that he'd met were a very large part of that. And he'd found strengths in himself that he didn't know he had. And he said, without doubt, this is the best thing I've ever done. We're not just talking about holidays, but the best thing he had ever done in his entire life, work-wise, holiday-wise, whatever. And it was just a joy to sit and listen to him for about 2 hours before he even drew breath. And just bubbling away about how kind people had been. There were a couple of times when he'd miscalculated the distance and realized he couldn't make it to the next albergue, and he asked how far it was, and somebody would say, well, look, just doss down here on the porch or in the garage or something. I'll put some cushions down, just when come in and have supper with us. And he was just blown away by that. So absolutely blown away by that. He did have a fair bit of Spanish, because he's done a lot of traveling in Spain and in South America as well. So, but he just found the response of people to him as a pilgrim amazing. And I wonder whether he'd have had that kind of experience at the height of the summer, which it was second half of July, whether if he'd been on the Camino Frances, whether he'd have had that. Once he would have, but I'm not sure about now. I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe these other Caminos are the way to go for people who really do want to have a different kind of experience. They're not so worried about having their bag carried and knowing exactly where they are with a GPS all the time. They're just prepared to allow some uncertainty into things, because very often the response to that will be something absolutely wonderful.
Right. The Camino will provide.
It will in the oddest ways. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. In your essay, you mentioned something that an hospitalera said, which was that the best thing that the Jacobin associations could do for the Camino would be to stop sending pilgrims down it. What's your response to that?
Well, she said that, back in 1995, after the onslaught, as she put it, of the Holy Year. No, I mean, we exist to facilitate people's journeys down the Camino. We can't just abdicate that function that we came into being to provide. I think we have a responsibility to, in a sense, prepare people prepare the pilgrims that we send. They tell them, make sure they understand how the albergues work and how the credencial works and what that's all about, and the benefits of maybe not every day, but at least some days carrying your own belongings, so that you really learn that very old but very salutary lesson about what you really need and what you can send home. It's one of the Camino's great lessons, and if you send all your clobber ahead by taxi, you never learn it. You may not, I shouldn't say you never learn it. You may learn it, having to go on a very small plane to an island somewhere, what you can leave behind. But it used to be that you learned pretty quickly what you weren't prepared to carry over the Pyrenees. And it is quite a salutary lesson. And I don't mean to denigrate in any way the journey of someone who actually cannot, for some reason or another, carry a pack. There are numerous people around who, for one reason or another, either can't or shouldn't carry a weight on their back, and they can carry it in some other way or have it sent ahead. That doesn't diminish from their pilgrimage at all. But if you're able-bodied, I mean, do have as broad an experience as you can, I think. So.
Good. Our Canadian association, the Canadian Company of Pilgrims, is right now engaged in a project to craft a Canadian Camino ethic, or a set of guidelines for a respectful and ethical pilgrimage. And it's all about ways of being on the way. And we want to find out or to discover and then promote some ways that pilgrims can have a positive impact on the Camino, on the people and the places that we visit, and be mindful and respectful of the environment that we're walking through. And so as we develop this statement, what advice would you have for the best way to go about promoting that, or anything that should definitely be included in such a statement?
In that chapter, if I'm not mistaken, we asked the kind of rhetorical question of, should we say, or should we have to say anything about? And then there's a whole long list of things. I think the first one is picnicking in churches. I mean, it's just such a no-no, and yet people do it all the time. It's raining, and so they go into the church and have their sandwiches. You just don't do that. Find a bar. But I would put the emphasis nowadays on matters ecological. Keeping carrying your own litter. Don't toss the plastic bottle into the ditch and imagine that the locals are going to thank you for that. I've mentioned, I think, somewhere that Rebecca Scott, living on the Meseta, organizes these cleanup groups every year made up of volunteers. And those are all Camino people that help out with that. But the big question is, why should they have to be doing that? Because pilgrims really should not be tossing, food wrappings and plastic bottles around. Anyway, I don't want to sort of belabor that, but just be responsible. I think the Canadian Company of Pilgrims has a wonderful ethic, as it is. I mean, I see Canadian pilgrims here, and you provide such wonderful hospitaleros in Rabanal. And, you know, I think it's very laudable that you are working on something like that. I would just say put the emphasis on, it shouldn't be hard nowadays because it's everywhere. It's a hot topic, but ecology and being responsible in the environment, if it's a forest, you know, don't smoke, you know, this kind of thing that's glaringly obvious in any other context, but maybe when people are tired and maybe not thinking terribly straight at the end of a day, they may just take the easy way. And, you know, instead of, I don't know, I used to carry a plastic bag myself and pick up other people's junk. And then at the end of the day, put that in a container somewhere and feel that I'd done a bit of good along the way. I'm sure I did mention this. The number of dogs we get in O Cebreiro, where people have fed them. I mean, the dogs are usually bored in the villages. The advent of pilgrims is something they just love. And so if people hold out half a sandwich, then that dog is going to go with you. And really, people can't imagine the problems that causes and the heartache that can cause too. So I would say, please don't tempt dogs away. If they do,
both for the dog and their owner.
Well, precisely, because it's often a family pet, but very often a working dog that is, it goes out with the cattle and it takes the place of a person in driving them to pasture. The ones in my village here do. They don't. They just have to open the gate, and the dog will take them up the road and into the field where they're supposed to go, and then go trotting home again. If there's no dog, the cows will be all over the place. So it does actually make a difference. And one of our members suggested to me years ago. She said, "I think we should set up a kind of care facility for dogs that come all the way along the Camino with the pilgrims and then don't know how to get home." Really? And I said, honestly, you're letting the tail wag the dog, literally, because the point is, don't encourage them to come in the first place. Prevention. If prevention is better than cure. If they do begin to come after you, then go back a bit with them and make sure somebody calls them and makes sure they don't come with you. It's an ongoing problem. So anyway, that's one that I didn't used to see so much of in the 90s, but I see it all the time now, just by virtue of where I live, I think. So,
well, and what you're saying makes me think about Canadians and our experience of hiking and trekking, because Canadians, by and large, I would say, are not used to traveling through agricultural lands or small villages. I mean, for many of us, our initiation into long distance walks was through wilderness walking, through things like hiking in the Rockies or West Coast Trail or something like that. And I think we have all kinds of sort of explorer associations when we think about putting a backpack and boots on. So what do you see as the essential similarities and differences between exploration and pilgrimage?
In many ways, exploration has retained that openness to surprise and to the unexpected that is being somehow channeled out of the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is the journey to a certain place, but it's also an interior journey. I can't remember which writer who said pilgrims are people who are looking for answers. And in a sense, if you're going on a wilderness hike, you know that your ultimate destination is going to be either the top of the mountain and after that, home. But you're not, I don't think, maybe that you want the thrill of that experience or conquering that particular physical obstacle. But I don't think it's maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe pitting yourself against yourself in the physical sense is in part that. Maybe people do approach the Camino that way too. So I'm not really sure about that. There are probably as many variants and things to be learned there as there are pilgrims. Maybe that's a very personal question about which I should probably say no more. It's I know what you mean about wilderness hiking. I mean, I know people have practiced for the Camino walking the Bruce Trail, which is marvelous. But you don't really meet that many people on it unless they're other walkers, I suppose. But it's I think it's the interior journey for me that has always been so very important. I've always walked on my own, you see, so I do contrast my own experience with that I see pilgrims in groups enacting, but maybe each of them is having that experience. I don't know, and I can't possibly really have a view on that. So, I was going to mention a very interesting book, which if listeners haven't come across it, it might attract them because it deals, at least in part, with exactly the question you've just posed. It's called Wanderlust, and it's by a wonderful journalist and writer called Rebecca Solnit from California. And she deals with pilgrimage, and she also deals, of course, with real wanderlust. And she is a great traveler herself. And so, I mean, that's a kind of a thriller of a book. It just encompasses so many things. It's really about walking in all its different modes. She even talks about urban walking and what can be learned about society and oneself by engaging in that. And she deals with walking at night and walking in the desert, different environments and so on. So that's a very good book on the subject of walking, hiking, pilgrimage, and all their permutations, really.
I would second that. I've read that book and I loved it. And Wanderlust is the name. A great title.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah. Yes,
and probably a title that resonates with those of us who can't stop going back to the Camino.
Well, yes. I mean, you think at first, well, Wanderlust, it gets somebody across the Sahara or through the jungles of Borneo, but it applies just as much to that sense of discovery, self-discovery that gets you out of an armchair and onto the Camino again in search of whatever it is for you. So very many dimensions.
Since you introduced the topic of books, one of the initiatives of the Canadian Company of Pilgrims is that we have on our website, we have a page that's dedicated to books that are written by Canadian authors about the Camino. And it's amazing how many books there are. I think we're well over 50 now, Canadian books about the Camino. And it seems to be growing. People love to write about their experience. And so I encourage people who are watching this to go and check out that page on the website and click on some of those books and find some that appeal to you. But I'd like to ask you, Laurie, what books would be on your Camino reading list?
Oh, wow. Well, a number of them I'd love to have had when I walked in 86. As a guidebook, I had Don Elias's big red book, the long, thin guide to the Camino, which was the only one there was back then. But we since, today's pilgrims have a huge choice of guidebooks and things, but the ones I think are so much more than that. They're excellent guidebooks, but they're also so much more, are John Brierley's ones, which are just excellent on every level. But did you mean really books that I would read before I went, or that I think pilgrims should read before they go? Or, just
either books that are good preparation for the Camino, or books that are good reflection on the Camino once you've experienced.
Yeah, I think there are both. I certainly think people should read something about the history of it and how it evolved in modern times, because it is a fascinating story, and they will see along the way many signs of that. There are layers upon layers of waymarking, not just the famous yellow arrows, but the earlier ones put there. If you know what you're looking at, you recognize those. But also a bit about Spanish history. You know, I was thinking the other day, how do you put this in context? Spain is an absolutely fascinating country, which now has these 8 recognized major pilgrimage routes converging on Santiago. And a book that comes to mind thinking of that, and not just of the Camino Frances, is something that covers really the whole country. It's interesting. It's by a Dutch writer called Kees Noteboom, and it's called Roads to Santiago. It came out in the 90s. But the funny thing about it is that he goes all over Spain because he keeps getting distracted. He sets out to go to Santiago, but he goes all over the place before he ever gets there. So he's got a chapter on Soria, and a chapter on Cordoba, and a chapter on this, that, and the other thing. But they're all, he draws upon Santiago and is interweaving Santiago all the time. And there's a lot of Spanish history woven into all of that. And eventually, of course, he does get to Santiago. I know another much more concise, because that is quite a hefty book, and it's not directly, doesn't focus entirely on the Camino. It's got a lot of abstruse info and direction to it. But William Meltzer's translation of Book 5 of the Codex Calixtinus has a very good introduction, which is 40 or 50 pages, which just pulls everything together. You know, history and faith and art and architecture. He was an art historian, American art historian from the University of Syracuse, who used to bring his students to Galicia. When they were on their junior year abroad in Madrid, he would bring them up to Galicia and take them along stretches of the Camino, and they would also live in O Cebreiro for a few weeks and get a flavor of what actually living in the Galician countryside was like. But another book, so I would recommend that. Nancy Fry's Pilgrim Stories, I think, which is from an anthropological point of view, really talking about what the whole thing, she interprets the Camino in that way, but she collected the reactions and the stories of people, both about walking the Camino and how it affected them in the lives they went back to, and you know, the ongoing effect in their lives. And that's another way of looking at it, but maybe save that one for when you come home, you know. But a beforehand book, it's a very old book now, but it's still around, and I mention it because it probably is quite easy to come by, just because it came out in the 50s by the very famous Hispanophile Walter Starkey. It's just called The Road to Santiago. And it's what the Camino Frances was like in 1957, before there were any guidebooks or any yellow arrows. And he pulls together a tremendous amount of Spanish history and Camino history. It's absolutely seamless and a really delightful read because he was such a character. He was the professor of Romance languages from Trinity College, Dublin, and he was also absolutely enamored and fascinated by the life of the Roma in Spain. And he, in every academic holiday when he could, he would take his violin, he was a fine violinist, take his violin and go hitching around Spain, living with the Roma wherever he could. And he had friends everywhere. He ended up in Madrid and ran the British Institute there for years. And he was a tremendous character, wonderful writer. So that book has a great deal to recommend it too. And then people's accounts of the Camino. I did want to mention one that I'm sure is on your webpage, Robert Ward's All the Good Pilgrims, which I think of the modern accounts that I've read certainly stands head and shoulders above the others, because he too has that wonderful ability to draw together many layers of experience and reaction in a very accessible way. It's not. It's always entertaining. Walter Starkey is always entertaining, and I think Robert Ward is too. So I would recommend that one. And then for anybody who really wants to revisit the Camino when they come home, this one I think is very special. Translated from Spanish by Rebecca Scott from Bolich, who was this wonderful Basque young man. It's called The Great Westward Walk. It's quite a large book, but beautifully written. And one of the interesting things about that is that that man walked the Camino knowing that he was very ill, and he died 2 days after finishing this book. And his father, kind of weighed up what to do with the manuscript and eventually asked Rebecca Scott to translate it. And she did an absolutely magnificent job of it. And this, I think, is as beautiful a book as I've ever read about the Camino, really. So there we are. Not easy to get hold of, perhaps, in Canada, but maybe it should be more easily available if you ask for it. Maybe you could get some sent over there somehow.
Yes.
But that's an absolutely wonderful book. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. That's a wonderful reading list, and several of the ones you mentioned I haven't read, so I'm going to have to get my reading glasses out and start.
Well,
I'd like to add. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say the one I haven't mentioned, of course, is Rebecca's own book,
Yes.
Furnace Full of God, which is about her. She actually lives right on the Camino Frances. It goes past the door. She and her husband, for years, effectively operated an albergue, and they still take in pilgrims very gladly and very welcome them wonderfully. But that's all about their experience of the Holy Year 2010 and what that was like, living with the door wide open, effectively, and living in a small Spanish village too. You get the flavor of that rural life of people who've known the Camino all their lives and just live their lives alongside it. So that's a special book too.
Yes, I'd echo that recommendation, and would also recommend to people a book that Tom mentioned in the introduction, which is Laurie's reissued A Hug for the Apostle, and the book we're talking about today, Waybread, which really is full of a lot of gems of info. There were a lot of things in here that I read that I didn't know about the Camino, and I'm so glad to know about, and particularly about the history of some of the English language people who've been involved through the confraternity or in other ways in the heritage of the Camino. So thank you, Laurie.
Yes. I mean, there's a chapter in there, and thank you for saying all that. There's a chapter in there about how Rabanal came into being,
Yes.
how Refugio Gauthelmo, how it happened. And that
Yes,
was
and for those who don't know, just tell us a little bit about what Gauthelmo and Rabanal are.
well, it grew out of an idea tossed onto the table at a committee meeting in 1988 when the confraternity was just coming up to celebrating its 5th anniversary. And we were looking for some meaningful way to celebrate that 5 years. And Walter Ivans said, why don't we raise the money to rehabilitate a building on the Camino Frances, somewhere where there is an enormous gap that walkers almost cannot do unless they're particularly strong walkers. Cyclists are another story, but walkers, there were so many long stretches then. And he said, why don't we raise the funds to create a Pilgrim hostel right on the route and make a whole stretch of the way feasible for people, open it up, and also devolve life to some village that is moribund, where one of those villages where there are a few elderly folk living all alone, and everyone else has gone off to the big city to find work, and there are no industries and no businesses in such places anymore. Why don't we do something that would bring life and residence back to a place like that? So we decided that was a pretty ambitious idea, but also a very interesting one. And we wrote to the nascent Spanish Federation with this offer, and they paired us up with the Amigos del Camino de Alberto. And Rabanal we said, send us where the need is greatest. We all had our favorite places, but my small contribution to this discussion was, I don't think we can say where we want to go. We must leave it to one of the to the Spanish Federation to tell us where we should go, where the need is greatest as they see it, not as we see it. So, we can't just pick a place and let them tell us. So they did. And what they chose, hallelujah, was Rabanal, because it was what we were thinking of anyway. But in the end, we didn't say so, they did. So it had, everybody's approbation, really. And 3 of us came out to have a look at what would become Refugio Gauthelmo. It was an abandoned parish house that hadn't had anyone living in it for 20 years. It was in an unbelievable condition. And I must say our courage nearly failed us, but didn't. We did debate whether we should go ahead with this or whether we should come home and say it's just too much. But we decided to come home and say, no, let's do it. Because one thing we realized was that if we said no, we'd never be taken seriously again. So it was either this or not do it at all, because it was just such a gigantic looking project. We'd made this offer and we had to come up with the wherewithal. So we set about doing it. And that was how Rabanal came into being, was everybody doing their bit. And one of the wonderful things we discovered was that everybody could do something. And people did the most amazing and astonishing things, from sponsored parachute jumps to selling off their books secondhand at the church bazaar, and the money going into the appeal. And Paul Graham on his penny farthing bicycle riding round and round in Bath with a money tin clipped on the handlebars and collecting £14 and 1 button. Somebody put a button in the jar. But people had a tremendous amount of fun, and we raised the necessary funds in under 2 years. So, and Rabanal actually opened its doors 2 years after we started, and that's pretty amazing. And we're still going. People raise money all the time. We sponsor a week, and as many of your members will have sponsored weeks, and all kinds of donations from fellow associations. for which we were very, very grateful. And it's still going strong. All the
Great.
hospitaleros. It's touched a lot of people's lives. And as I say, everybody contributes in some way. And I think the hospitaleros do an absolutely fabulous job. So,
and a wonderful example to the Jacobean associations of what can be done if you put your mind to it.
Well, yes. And another aspect of it all was that we seem to have set off a chain of similar projects, because within about a year of us beginning, the Italians were there, the Swiss were there, the German associations, all different ones were drawn in, and various albergues were created by them. It just became something that the Spanish Federation was very, very glad to see, because their own associations were still very small and there wasn't much money to spare. And there really wasn't a fundraising tradition in Spain at all. It just, people were used to giving things in kind, but getting out and going and banging on doors or writing to companies or picking up the telephone to ask charitable donors for money, just that was a new one. And they do it now, but they didn't then. So I think we've helped to kind of spread the means of doing it. Has certainly taken off. But the Italian albergue at San Nicolás de Puente Fitero was case in point. They've always said that they looked at what the confraternity had done in Rabanal and thought, well, we could do that. We could do that, and they did. So
yeah, and what these association-run albergues have done is to perpetuate and continue the tradition of hospitality and donativo, albergues. So
yes, traditional ways of receiving pilgrims. They all have put their own personality and character on their different albergues. There's a wonderful German one in La Faba, where they also have a herb garden. They also have flowers, and they all their hospitaleros are avid gardeners, and they grow all kinds of things, and they give the fruit to the pilgrims, and there are always flowers on the tables, and they take tremendous pride in that. Yeah. So
lovely. Well, thank you so much, Laurie. This has been just a fascinating discussion with you today. And again, thanks for making time for us. And we'll say
thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about the Camino, which I'm always overjoyed to do. So I hope it's proved interesting to the members, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
We will be doing some other recordings of other chapters in Laurie's book, so please look for those. And we're going to be signing off right now, but the conversation will continue. So thank you for starting it out so well, Lea and Laurie. Appreciate that.